while this novel is really about personal grief, this is one of the best novels that I've read in a long time on that kind of cultural grief anguish, that seemingly omnipresent sense of doom that permeates modern society. Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Gabriel Blackwell's Doomtown, which was published by Zerogram Press just last month. Zerogram Press is a pretty small and relatively young press, which focuses on contemporary literature, and they publish authors as varied as Stephen Moore, Jen Craig, Greg Gerke, Rick Harsh, and Jim Gower. And they very kindly sent me this review copy of Blackwell's latest novel, which I immediately began reading upon opening the package and really got sucked into for a few days. Blackwell's writing really is hypnotic, as it uses this recursive and looping writing style that reminded me at times of Gerald Murnane and Thomas Bernhard, and at other times of Jon Fosse. But I think most especially it reminded me of the Norwegian author Dag Solstad's writing. Both Solstad and Blackwell used this recursive and circular and reflexive writing style to really penetrate deeply into the kinds of language that they use to shape their characters. The sentences spiral and circle the emotions and meaning that they want to convey, and with each dependent clause, they come closer and closer to the center. They come closer and closer to the point. Doomtown is about this linguistics professor and his wife, who are both suffering deeply. I'll avoid major spoilers in this review, but I do need to spoil like the first fourth of the book to even be able to talk about it. We discover relatively early on that their child, their son, is deceased fairly recently. And this event really isn't mentioned directly for a while, as the narrator circles around it but never names it, perhaps out of denial and the fear that as soon as he names it, it becomes real. But it's clear from very early on that this event permeates everything in the novel. This couple has gone through the worst possible thing a parent can go through, and they're trying to recover and trying to become whole again. And this idea of trying to recover, of trying to put things back together and become whole again, is played out in the opening scene of this book, as they're shopping at a Macy's to buy a new decorative bowl to replace the one that broke about a year ago. It was beyond repair, and so the narrator went online and found an exact replica. They go to the store to buy it, and then while they're at the store, the narrator has this moment, this epiphany, in which he feels this sense of doom, where he feels like his marriage, just like the bowl, is utterly beyond repair. And let me actually just read an excerpt from this scene because, well, it's quite good. In fact, now that I think about it, it was precisely at the moment that, as I recall, I had finally gone from being simply concerned with the pace of our selection process, of the bowl I mean, into what I would describe as an all-encompassing feeling of desperate, frantic numbness. So much so that I pictured myself in the moment with my hand in my right pocket, on the point, of pulling out my phone and checking the time, checking the weather for the day, checking even, and this I think says it all, doesn't it, my school email, which could only at that time of the day have been depressing or worrying, or depressing and worrying. Still, I picture myself with my right hand in my pocket, even though I cannot, no matter how hard I try, remember what pants I would have been wearing, or whether I would have been resting more weight on the one leg than the other, or what my other hand was doing, for that matter. And this is one of the dangers of language, this false sense of certainty in the presence of even one detail, when really that one detail is vastly outweighed by the many unrecalled details, and which unrecalled details ought to alert us to the deception, but which deception language instead conveniently covers up. When suddenly, and for only the briefest of seconds, I thought again about the dog I'd seen get hit by the white SUV on our way to the Macy's, and this inescapable feeling of doom came over me. That was the start of it, that moment. And this scene goes on as our narrator really fixates on this specific moment, that this feeling of doom, this feeling of dread comes upon him. But throughout the book, there is this inability to precisely name these emotions. Well, it's either an inability or a refusal. That is, it's called a feeling of doom throughout, but the exact parameters of that emotion are inexact, and our narrator goes to lengths to try to define it, while at the same time sort of refusing to directly address it. And this is really where Blackwell's writing style is so thematically fitting. The reflexive and spiraling sentences really show the narrator's inability to pin down this emotion. And he's a professor of linguistics. If anyone could pin this down in language, it would be him. But I think what this does so effectively is show how grief is multifaceted and how it aggregates and how it manifests itself in all these different aspects of our lives and of our psyches. But not only is our narrator grieving over his deceased child, but the world in which he lives is experiencing all of these different tragedies. Some environmental, there's this recurring motif of the power going out and of all of these storms and tornadoes kind of ravaging the country, and others social and cultural. There's a suicide epidemic at the university where he teaches, and there's, well, school shootings. That is to say, the world in which he lives sounds very similar to our own. So while this novel is really about personal grief, this is one of the best novels that I've read in a long time on that kind of cultural grief anguish, that seemingly omnipresent sense of doom that permeates modern society. In fact, I was reading this book when I learned of the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and I needed to put the book down for a couple of days. While I'm not a parent and therefore can't fully imagine what it would be like to lose a child, the sense of doom that is described in this novel is so palpable and so, unfortunately, relatable. This book describes the Weltschmerz, the world weariness that I and pretty much everyone I talk to who stays up to date on the countless tragedies around the world, but especially here in the States, that feeling that everyone feels, but they can't fully describe. That funny feeling, as Bo Burnham might say. Have I scared anyone away from reading this book yet? I hope I haven't. This book is, while it's primarily about this feeling of doom, it isn't all just as depressing as I'm making it out to be. There are moments that are funny or at least sardonically amusing. There's a particular moment where the narrator goes on about why and how he became disenchanted with academia. And it's very worth reading, though I won't do it here because it's quite long, but I'll flash it on screen now, and I'd recommend you do read it. It's quite good. And so our narrator is obsessive and hyper self-aware. One way in which this manifests clearly is in his desire to put his finger on this feeling of doom. He has this inability to actually name it, but he has this obsession with this feeling and trying to put it into language. But he's also going through a failing marriage. And so a lot of this book is about his relationship with his wife. And so there's many parts in here in which he has to try to describe how his wife is feeling and how his wife is working through this grief. But he's very careful to constantly pull back from describing her feelings to note that, he shouldn't speak for her and he doesn't fully understand her. I mean, he barely fully understands himself after all. And so throughout there is this careful tension between this desire to understand and the recognition of his inability to understand. Not only is he a grieving father, but he's a grieving husband, and this grief is really tearing his marriage and his life apart. The narrator is attempting to understand the world around him and to understand his wife, but he's constantly kind of failing to do so. All of these emotions are being pressed into him, often against his will, and he's trying to process them. And he's trying to understand them. And this is really where this book shines, in the careful presentation and dissection of these emotions that go through him in these seemingly small events, like shopping for a decorative bowl at a Macy's. Each short chapter relates a single or small event or thought, but it penetrates and probes so deeply and extrapolates so much from that single thought or event. And the real power of this book comes from its prose, which I have to say again is really wonderful. Again, I found it very similar to Dag Solstad with hints of Gerald Murnane. This book is really about language and how we use language to attempt to convey emotion. Those two things, language and emotion, just like in Murnane, don't perfectly line up, but language is really the only tool that we have. Despite this book really excels at the sentence level writing. It has that looping and hypnotic style that I just really like. But the real reason you should read this book is how effectively it explores the personal and more universal, just haunting grief and anguish and trauma that comes with living in modern day America. Doomtown explores these so effectively through the lens of a grieving father that I can really only compare to what Stephen Dixon does in Interstate and what Stig Sæterbakken does in Through the Night. Though Stephen Dixon does this through the vein of a thriller, whereas Stig Sæterbakken does this through the vein of a horror novel. Doomtown, on the other hand, is in many ways a dystopian novel, but it's hard to call it a dystopia when it so accurately reflects reality. It's also in many ways an apocalyptic novel, as the trauma and grief bubble just beneath the surface and threaten to erupt in a similar way to how it does in Pola Oloixarac's Mona. But again, it can't fully be apocalyptic because so many people across America are constantly feeling these feelings and living with it every day. Either way, this is a book for our modern times. And if you're anything like me and you live with this ever-present sense of doom in the back of your mind, I think you'll actually find this book in some ways to be relieving because it describes this emotion so well. And by doing so, it reminds you that you're not alone in that feeling. But for now, thanks for watching.